Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the history of a molecule so deceptive, so perfectly engineered for human weakness, that it spent the better part of a century disguised as something it was never meant to be. It wore the costume of medicine. It carried the endorsement of governments, generals, and family doctors. It sat in amber glass bottles on bathroom shelves in quiet suburban homes, and on the steel shelving of military field hospitals, and in the ration kits of men who were about to do terrible things to one another across the frozen plains of Europe. It was sold as a cure. It was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a weapon. Picture an American kitchen in the autumn of 1955. The linoleum is spotless. The children are at school. The husband is at the office. And the woman standing at the sink, her name is unimportant because she is every woman in every suburb, in every quiet street of post-war America, is exhausted in a way that a cup of coffee will not touch. Bone deep, soul level, the kind of fatigue that arrives not from a single sleepless night, but from years of invisible labor, of smiling at the right moments, of making everything appear effortless. She goes to the medicine cabinet. She reaches for the amber bottle. A small, pristine white tablet sits on her palm. Her doctor prescribed it 3 weeks ago with a reassuring smile and a sentence that contained the words, weight management and energy, and perfectly safe. She swallows it with a sip of tap water. Within 30 minutes, something extraordinary happens. The exhaustion dissolves. Not gradually, suddenly, like fog lifting from a harbor all at once. A wave of crystalline clarity floods through her. The kitchen that felt like a prison moments ago now feels manageable, even pleasurable. She cleans the counters. She starts dinner 2 hours early. She folds laundry with a kind of focused calm she had nearly forgotten was possible. She feels, for the first time in years, entirely and completely alive. She does not know what the pill is doing to the architecture of her brain. She does not know that the molecule now moving through her bloodstream was synthesized not by a caring pharmaceutical chemist seeking to relieve suffering, but as a tool of warfare, tested on soldiers, fed to pilots on suicide missions, used to push human bodies past the edge of what they were designed to endure. She does not know any of this. She thinks it is medicine. This is the history of the most deceptive stimulant ever created. A molecule born in a quiet Tokyo laboratory, weaponized across 2 oceans, packaged in foil and endorsed by physicians, and sold to a trusting public long before anyone understood what it was quietly, methodically destroying. Before we continue, if these journeys into the darker corridors of history help you find rest at the end of a long day, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is there. It moves me every time to know how many different corners of the earth gather here together in the dark. But now, dim the lights a little more. Set the phone face down, and let us begin at the beginning. There is a plant. It grows in the windswept plateaus of Central Asia and across the arid highlands of China and Mongolia, where the winters are long and the wind cuts without apology. It is not a beautiful plant. It has no flowers worth noting, no fruit, no particular grace. Its stems are thin and jointed, a dusty gray-green, reaching upward in sparse, almost desperate clusters from the cracked earth. A traveler walking past it would not slow their pace. A botanist cataloging the flora of the region might note it with professional detachment and move on. And yet, For over 5,000 years, the healers and physicians of traditional Chinese medicine knew its secret. They called it Ma Huang. They dried its stems, brewed them into bitter teas, and prescribed the resulting infusion for conditions that would be immediately familiar to any modern doctor: asthma, nasal congestion, fever, the heavy-chested breathlessness that comes when the airways close. The plant, in ways its users could feel but not yet explain, opened the lungs, it quickened the pulse, it lifted the spirits of the fatigued and clarified the thinking of the foggy-minded. It worked because of what it contained: a molecule coiled inside those dry, unremarkable stems. A simple alkaloid that modern chemistry would eventually name ephedrine. For 5 millennia, this was sufficient. The knowledge lived in the hands of healers, passed from teacher to student, written into the margins of ancient pharmacopoeias in characters that Western science could not yet read. It was a folk remedy, effective, trusted, contained. And then, in the second half of the 19th century, the world changed. The great collision of cultures that defined that era, the forced opening of trade routes, the sending of young scholars abroad, the insatiable appetite of Western analytical chemistry to name and isolate and replicate everything the natural world had quietly been doing for centuries, brought a Japanese chemist to the city of Berlin. And in Berlin, in a laboratory at the university, he sat down with the dried stems of a plant he had grown up knowing, and he began to pull it apart. His name was Nagai Nagayoshi. He was born in 1844 in Tokushima Prefecture, the son of a doctor. He had grown up watching his father heal people with the knowledge of plants, and he had absorbed from childhood the idea that understanding what nature does is the beginning of being able to help people. He studied Western medicine as a young man at the Dutch medical school in Nagasaki, one of the few windows through which Japanese scholars could observe European science in those years. And then, in 1871, under government sponsorship, he traveled to Prussia. He was part of the first group of Japanese students sent to study in Europe, and he arrived in Berlin carrying the habits of a man raised in one world and now required to master another. He worked in the laboratory of August Wilhelm von Hofmann, one of the giants of 19th century organic chemistry. He earned his doctorate. He married a German woman named Therese Schumacher, the daughter of a lumber magnate. He was, by all accounts, a thorough and patient researcher, a man who understood that the work of chemistry is not revelation but accumulation. You take a substance apart, you name each piece, you put it back together and see what you understand now that you did not understand before. In 1883, he returned to Japan and took up a professorship at Tokyo Imperial University. He became the first person in Japan to hold a doctoral degree in pharmacy, and the research focus he chose: the chemical analysis of traditional Japanese and Chinese herbal medicines, was both professionally appropriate and deeply personal. He was not trying to invent something new. He was trying to understand what the old things actually were. In 1885, he succeeded in his first great task. Working methodically through the chemistry of Ma Huang, he isolated its active principle. He extracted it, crystallized it, identified it. Ephedrine, a stimulant alkaloid that relaxes the muscles around the airways, constricts blood vessels, raises blood pressure and heart rate. The molecular explanation for 5,000 years of clinical observation. It was a genuine achievement, and Nagai recognized it as such. He published his findings, and ephedrine entered the Western pharmacological record. But Nagai was a chemist, And chemists, by nature and training, are what one might call compulsive tinkerers. They do not look at a molecule and see a finished thing. They look at it and see a structure with handles, points of attachment, configurations that might be altered, groups that might be added or removed. Nature builds one version. A chemist asks, what happens if you build a slightly different one? In 1893, at 8 years after isolating ephedrine, Nagai performed what chemists call a reduction. He took his purified ephedrine and subjected it to a specific chemical process. Using red phosphorus and iodine, he stripped away an oxygen atom and rearranged what remained. The procedure was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no visible transformation. One clear solution became another. But what he held in his hands when the process was complete was a compound that did not exist anywhere in nature. No plant had ever produced it. No organism had ever made it. He called it methamphetamine. The paper he published describing the synthesis was precise, professionally worded, and largely unremarked upon. It appeared in a Japanese chemistry journal as one finding among many. A structural curiosity, a new compound with stimulant properties somewhat more pronounced than the parent molecule. Nagai himself noted these properties without alarm and without particular excitement. He had no pharmaceutical application in mind. He was not imagining soldiers or housewives or addiction or war. He was a careful scientist who had made a new thing, noted it accurately, and moved on to the next question. The molecule sat in the literature, a footnote, a curiosity. For 26 years, it waited. The man who woke it was named Akira Ogata. He was born in Osaka in 1887, which made him a generation younger than Nagai. And he came to pharmacology through a different door. Through physiology, through the question of how substances move through the body and what they do when they arrive. He studied in Tokyo, then traveled to Berlin as Nagai had done, and received his degree from the Humboldt University in 1919. It was there, in that same European scientific tradition that had shaped his predecessor, that he returned to the problem of the molecule Nagai had described a quarter of a century before. Ogata was not simply repeating Nagai's work. He was improving it, refining it. His method, reduction of ephedrine using red phosphorus and iodine, produced not the unstable liquid form that Nagai had created, but something quite different, a crystalline solid, methamphetamine hydrochloride. Hold that image for a moment, a crystalline solid. What Ogata had done, though he could not have fully understood its significance at the time, was to create the form in which this molecule would eventually reach every corner of the world. Crystalline methamphetamine could be compressed into tablets. It could be dissolved in water. It could be stored at room temperature indefinitely. It was stable, portable, and, as anyone who subsequently used it would confirm, extraordinarily potent, because it crossed the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than its parent compound ephedrine, because it persisted in the body for up to 10 hours rather than the 2 or 3 that cocaine managed, because it produced a magnitude of effect that no naturally occurring stimulant could match. Ogata returned to Tokyo and took up a position at the university's Faculty of Medicine, where he taught for nearly 3 decades. He did not foresee what he had created any more than Nagai had. He was a scientist in the tradition of his field, methodical, precise, concerned with chemical structure rather than social consequence. 2 years after Ogata's crystallization, in 1921, the Japanese pharmaceutical company Dainippon Seiyaku filed a trademark for a commercial product based on his work. They called it Philopon. The name is thought to derive from the Japanese words for fatigue and the phrase "with a single blow," meaning, roughly, fatigue disappears instantly, or perhaps from the Greek philoponus, meaning fond of work. Both interpretations feel, in retrospect, like something close to a dark joke. Philopon was marketed initially for the treatment of asthma, narcolepsy, depression, and fatigue. The side effects were noted without alarm. The addictive potential was not yet understood because addiction as a concept was still in its infancy, still being argued over in the corridors of medicine by men who were not yet sure whether the problem lay in the substance or in the person who could not stop taking it. In 1921, methamphetamine had a brand name and a bottle and a price. It had moved from a footnote in a chemistry journal to a product on a shelf. And somewhere in Europe, in the sprawling industrial cities, where war was already being quietly planned, in the minds of men who thought in terms of force and speed and the elimination of human limitation, someone was paying attention. There is a particular kind of silence that precedes catastrophe. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of accumulation, the silence of things gathering momentum in places you cannot yet see. In the 1920s and early 1930s, as methamphetamine sat in Japanese pharmacies and trickled quietly through medical journals, that gathering was already underway. Nagai Nagayoshi lived until 1929. He was 84 years old when he died, a respected figure in Japanese pharmaceutical science, a man who had built institutions and trained generations of chemists, and once, late in life, hosted Albert Einstein and his wife for a visit. Whether he ever thought, in those final years, about the molecule he had made in his laboratory 36 years earlier, whether he ever wondered what the world might eventually do with it, we do not know. What we know is that the molecule itself was just beginning. The quiet phase was ending. What came next would not be quiet at all. There is a factory in Berlin. It sits in the Johannisthal district, a grey and functional building that smells of chemical solvents and machine oil and the particular sterile sharpness of industrial pharmaceutical production. Inside, men in white coats move between pressing machines and packaging lines with the quiet efficiency of people who have been doing the same thing long enough that they no longer think about what they are making. They are making tablets, small, round, unremarkable tablets, 3 milligrams each. The machines press them by the hundreds of thousands. The sound is rhythmic, almost meditative, a soft mechanical pulse, over and over, in the cold air of a Berlin morning in 1938. The company is called Daimler-Werke. The drug is called Pervitin. And in the months following its commercial release in the winter of 1937, it will move through German society with a speed and penetration that the company's founders did not entirely anticipate, though they were not unhappy about it. Within weeks of appearing in pharmacies, Pervitin was available without a prescription. Within months, it was everywhere. Workers on night shifts took it to stay alert. University students took it to study through the early hours of the morning. Businessmen took it to sustain the relentless pace that modernity demanded. Housewives, and here the echo of a story we will return to later is already audible, took it for the weight and the fatigue and the quiet suffocation of lives that required more of them than any human being should be expected to give. One could even, in those early months, purchase boxed chocolates spiked with methamphetamine, and they were called Hildebrand chocolates, marketed toward women. The advertising was elegant and cheerful, a small, sophisticated indulgence that happened to contain, alongside the cocoa and sugar, a precise dose of a central nervous system stimulant that had been engineered from a military plant and crystallized in a Tokyo laboratory less than 20 years before. The German people ate them. They did not ask what was in them with any great urgency, because the feeling that followed was simply wonderful, clarity, energy, the sense that the list of things to be done today was not a burden but an opportunity, the grey weight of ordinary life lifting, briefly, completely. This is what methamphetamine does in its first hours. It is important to understand this clearly because the seduction is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Nobody takes a substance that makes them feel immediately terrible. The horror of methamphetamine is not that it feels bad. The horror is that it feels, in those first encounters, like the best version of yourself that you have ever inhabited. That is the trap. And in 1938, across Germany, millions of people were walking into it with no map of what lay at the other side. And the man who brought methamphetamine from the pharmacy shelf to the battlefield was a chemist named Friedrich Hauschild. He had been paying attention to international pharmaceutical developments with the focused interest of a competitive professional. In 1936, at the Berlin Olympics, he had observed the use of benzedrine, the American amphetamine, as a performance-enhancing substance among athletes. He understood immediately what he was looking at: a stimulant that pushed the body past its ordinary limits, a chemical that dissolved fatigue. He also understood that methamphetamine, the molecule his colleagues at Daimler had been pressing into civilian tablets, was more potent than benzedrine. It crossed the blood-brain barrier more efficiently. Its effects lasted longer. Dose for dose, it hit harder. In 1937, he patented a method for its synthesis. Daimler Werke filed the commercial trademark in October of that year and began production. And as civilian sales climbed through 1938, a military doctor named Otto Friedrich Ranke was watching with professional interest. Ranke was the director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Medicine. His specific problem, the problem that any military planner is eventually forced to confront, was the fragility of the human body under conditions of sustained combat. Soldiers slept, they tired, they faltered. The machinery of Blitzkrieg, the doctrine of lightning war that the Wehrmacht was preparing to unleash upon Europe, depended on speed that the human metabolism was not designed to sustain. Soldiers were, as Ranke framed it in his research, the weak link in an otherwise powerful machine. He decided to test a solution. He recruited 90 university students and administered Pervitin under controlled conditions, measuring alertness, performance, endurance, and cognitive function. The results were unambiguous. The drug worked. It eliminated the need for sleep over sustained periods. It maintained physical and psychological performance in conditions that would otherwise produce rapid deterioration. It made men fearless, focused, and willing to continue when every biological signal was ordering them to stop. Ranke wrote his conclusion in language that was almost exuberant for a military medical document. Pervitin, he determined, could help Germany win the war. Nobody of consequence disagreed with him. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 was the first field test. Germany moved through its eastern neighbor in weeks. 100,000 Polish soldiers killed. The country carved apart by October. The invasion introduced a new form of warfare: Blitzkrieg, lightning war, mechanized columns advancing at speeds that no previous military doctrine had prepared defenders to meet. The strategy depended on continuous pressure, on never allowing the enemy time to regroup, on pushing through the hours of darkness that armies had traditionally used to rest and resupply. Pervitin was issued. Soldiers took it. They moved through the night. They advanced through conditions of cold and exhaustion and psychological terror that would otherwise have halted them. The invasion was over before most of Europe had processed what kind of war this was going to be. But Poland was a rehearsal. France was the performance. In the late winter and early spring of 1940, as German commanders planned their assault on Western Europe, an order came down through the military supply chain that staggers the imagination even now, more than 80 years later. It was called, with bureaucratic neutrality, the Stimulant Decree. And what it authorized was this: over the course of 10 to 12 weeks, more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin and its variants would be distributed to the approximately 3 million soldiers of the Wehrmacht preparing to move against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. 35 million tablets to 3 million men. At the Daimler-Werke factory, the machines that had been pressing tablets steadily through the civilian boom years now ran at a pace that bordered on frenzy. Production reached, at its peak, in 833,000 tablets per single day. The factory did not stop. The packaging lines did not stop. The trucks loading crates into military supply chains did not stop. Some of the methamphetamine was pressed into the familiar tablet form that soldiers were now accustomed to. Some of it was distributed as what the Luftwaffe called Fliegerschokolade, flyer's chocolate, for pilots who preferred to consume their dose in a form that required no glass of water and left no pharmaceutical paper trail in a pocket. Tank crews received what was called Panzerschokolade, tanker's chocolate. The names were affectionate, almost playful, the kind of nicknames that arise in military cultures when something becomes both necessary and slightly absurd. Other units simply called the tablets Stuka Tabletten, Stuka tablets, after the dive bombers, or Hermann Göring Pillen, a sardonic reference to the commander of the Luftwaffe, whose own pharmaceutical appetites were widely and derisively known among the troops. The soldiers took them, 3 milligrams per tablet, 2 to 4 tablets per day recommended. Some took more. And then they walked into France. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary military feats in modern history, and methamphetamine is woven through its fabric in ways that historians are still arguing about, but cannot dismiss. The Wehrmacht cut through the Ardennes forest, a route that French and British planners had considered impassable for a mechanized army, and emerged behind the Allied defensive line, with a speed that produced a kind of collective military shock on the other side. French headquarters lost contact with its frontline units. Communications collapsed. The response that might have stopped the German advance never came, because by the time the orders were formulated, the situation they were responding to had already changed entirely. The soldiers driving this advance fought and marched for 10 consecutive days without meaningful rest. They covered an average of 22 miles per day. Not in the measured pace of a military exercise, but under fire, through enemy territory, sustaining the relentless forward pressure that Blitzkrieg demanded. One medical historian, Peter Steinkamp, would later frame it in terms that are difficult to forget. Blitzkrieg, he wrote, was guided by methamphetamine. If not to say that Blitzkrieg was founded on methamphetamine. The British Army, in moving to meet the German advance, found itself trapped. Outmaneuvered and encircled, it fell back to the beaches of a small French coastal town called Dunkirk. The evacuation that followed, hundreds of thousands of soldiers lifted from an open beach under fire, became one of the great stories of the war. But the fact that the British were on that beach in the first place, that the whole weight of their expeditionary force had been compressed into that narrow strip of sand, was a consequence of an advance so fast and so sustained that no military analyst in 1939 would have predicted it possible. France fell in 6 weeks. But there is another side to this story, one that the triumphant dispatches did not include. In the field hospitals and medical tents along the German advance, a different picture was emerging. Soldiers who had been consuming Pervitin for days at a stretch were not simply tired when the drug wore off. They were collapsing, not sleeping, collapsing into states of exhaustion so deep that some could not be roused for 24 hours or more. Their hands shook, their hearts raced and then stuttered. Some developed fevers. Some became paranoid in ways that crossed from combat anxiety into something darker. Suspicion of their own officers, disconnection from shared reality, the particular brittleness of a mind that has been chemically denied rest for too long. Some soldiers became violent in ways that their commanding officers could not entirely attribute to the enemy. Some died of heart failure. Some, in the psychotic phases that heavy and sustained Pervitin use produced, took their own lives. Veterans who survived and were later interviewed about their experience of the drug spoke in terms that carry their own specific horror. One described the fear after days on Pervitin that he might never sleep again, that the ability to sleep had been consumed along with the fatigue. When we could not sleep anymore, he said, we thought we must die. There was a young soldier who wrote letters home. His name was Heinrich Böll. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1972, and the body of work that earned him that prize was saturated with the experience of a generation of Germans destroyed by war. In May 1940, writing from the front to his family in Cologne, he made a request that reads with particular weight from this distance. He asked them to send more Pervitin. He described it as making miracles. He needed it, he wrote, to function. He could not imagine performing his duties without it. He was 22 years old, physically dependent on methamphetamine, and winning a war. Across the Pacific, a parallel story was unfolding with its own specific darkness. Japan had never stopped producing Philopon. From the moment Dainippon Seiyaku trademarked the drug in 1921, it had moved steadily through Japanese society, and as the war years intensified, through Japanese industry and the military with a comprehensiveness that makes Germany's use look, by comparison, almost restrained. Between 1939 and 1945, historians estimate that approximately 1 billion Philopon tablets were produced in Japan. 1 billion. Factory workers took them to work the brutal hours that wartime production demanded. Soldiers took them. And then, in the final years of the Pacific War, as Japan's strategic situation deteriorated beyond any rational prospect of conventional victory, another use was found: the pilots of the Tokotai. The word translates approximately as special attack units. The West would come to know them by a different name: kamikaze. These were young men, many of them barely past adolescence, some still in their teens, who had been selected or had volunteered for missions from which they would not return. They would fly aircraft loaded with explosives directly into Allied warships. The military logic was arithmetical and terrible. One pilot, one plane, one ship. Human precision weaponry. Before each mission, they were given high doses of Philipon. What the drug did in those final hours, in those young men sitting in their cockpits awaiting takeoff, we can only reason about from the outside. The fear that might have overwhelmed, suppressed. The hesitation that might have grown in those last minutes, dissolved. The body's frantic biological arguments for survival, silenced by a molecule that floods the brain's chemistry and replaces it with something artificial and absolute. Whether this constitutes mercy or atrocity is a question that resists easy resolution. What we know is that they flew. By 1941, the German military command had begun to understand what it had done. The side effects were too numerous and too serious to ignore. Addiction was becoming visible in the ranks. Soldiers were hoarding their pills. Commanders were reporting behavioral deterioration. The Reich Healthführer, a man named Leonardo Conti, had been raising alarms since 1939. Warnings that were largely dismissed until the evidence became undeniable. And in 1941, Pervitin was made a prescription-only substance in Germany. New regulations tightened its military distribution. Soldiers were to receive only a few tablets at a time. They were discouraged from taking them in combat. The regulations were, by most accounts, widely ignored. The drug continued to flow through the Wehrmacht until the very end of the war. In the final months, a new compound called D-nihinate was being developed and tested. A cocktail containing methamphetamine, cocaine, and a morphine-based painkiller, designed to push the last reserves of a collapsing military machine past even the extreme limits that Pervitin alone had established. The war ended before D9 could be deployed at scale. And then the guns stopped. The factories went quiet. The supply chains dissolved. And the men who had been consuming methamphetamine in quantities that would horrify a modern addiction specialist came home, or did not come home, and the drug they had depended on for years was suddenly unavailable through official channels. But the stockpiles existed, and the hunger for what those stockpiles contained did not evaporate simply because the war was over. It never does. The war ended on a Tuesday, August 14th, 1945. Japan's Emperor Hirohito delivered his surrender announcement in a radio address. The first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice, and a silence fell across the Pacific Theater that had no precedent in living memory. The silence of machinery stopped, of engines grounded, of weapons laid down in fields and on decks and in warehouses along the length of an empire that had, in the space of a few weeks, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. In the pharmaceutical factories of Osaka and Tokyo and a dozen smaller industrial cities, the Philipon production lines went still, but the stockpiles did not disappear. Warehouses across Japan contained quantities of methamphetamine that had been manufactured for a war effort that was now over. Tablets pressed in their millions, bottled and crated and labeled for distribution to a military that no longer existed. Supply chains built to feed an army had been severed at the source, but the product at the end of those chains remained. It sat in storage facilities under the supervision of companies and military administrators who were themselves now trying to understand what kind of country Japan was going to be and what the rules of that country were going to look like. The answer to that second question took time to arrive. And in that interval, in the administrative chaos of a defeated nation undergoing occupation and reconstruction, in the weeks and months when the old authorities had collapsed and the new ones had not yet fully assembled, the stockpiles began to move. Not through official channels, through other ones. The organization that understood opportunity in those particular conditions was the Yakuza. Japan's organized crime networks had survived the war, with their structures largely intact, and they possessed something that the circumstances of 1945 placed at a premium: distribution networks, enforcement capacity, and the pragmatic willingness to move whatever product the moment demanded. In the chaos of post-war Japan, food shortages, mass unemployment, millions of demobilized soldiers with no work and no clear future, a population that had spent years operating under conditions of sustained stress and exhaustion, methamphetamine was not a difficult product to sell. The Yakuza moved the surplus into the civilian black market with a speed and efficiency that reflected both organizational competence and a clear reading of what the population needed, or believed it needed. And here is where the story becomes quietly devastating in a way that the battlefield narrative does not prepare you for. Because the people who reached for Philippon in the ruins of post-war Japan were not soldiers. They were not young men with a war to fight or a mission to complete. They were ordinary citizens, factory workers trying to meet the production quotas of reconstruction, day laborers working brutal hours for insufficient pay, students cramming for examinations in a system that had not been rebuilt fast enough to accommodate them. Men and women who had survived a war that had taken everything from them and were now required to build something from nothing immediately, on insufficient sleep and insufficient food and insufficient hope. Methamphetamine offered them what it had always offered: the temporary erasure of limitation, the feeling of capability in conditions designed to produce incapacity. They took it. By the late 1940s, the methamphetamine use in Japan had moved well beyond the margins of society that pharmaceutical black markets typically occupy. It had become, in certain urban areas and industrial communities, something closer to a social norm. Injection use was spreading, a more intense and more immediately destructive route of administration than the tablet form the military had used. The drug moved through youth culture and through the demi-monde of post-war urban Japan with a momentum that the government was struggling to measure, let alone address. In 1951, alarmed by what the data was beginning to show, the Japanese Ministry of Health banned stimulant production. It was, in principle, the right response. In practice, it was insufficient. The ban restricted legal production. It did not eliminate the infrastructure that had been built to supply a market that was now deeply established. Companies continued to manufacture. The Yakuza continued to distribute. The product continued to flow, now carrying the additional premium that prohibition reliably attaches to any substance that enough people want, badly enough to seek through illegal channels. By 1954, Japanese public health officials were looking at numbers that were almost incomprehensible for a substance that had been a military medication less than a decade before. The estimated number of methamphetamine addicts in Japan had reached 550,000 people. Some surveys of the period placed the number higher, and the country that had given the molecule its first commercial brand name and produced 1 billion tablets to fuel its war effort was now watching its civilian population consumed by what that molecule did when the war was over, and there was nothing left to be focused on except its own hunger for itself. Japan would spend the better part of the following decade fighting its way back from this. The legal and public health responses that followed, stricter enforcement, treatment programs, a sustained public education effort, would eventually reduce the epidemic to manageable levels. But the cost, measured in individual lives and families and communities, was staggering. And the lesson was one that the rest of the world was not paying sufficient attention to. Because while Japan was learning, in the most brutal possible way, in what methamphetamine did to a civilian population, the rest of the world was drawing different conclusions from the same evidence. In Germany, the post-war situation was less dramatic, but no less telling. Pervitin had been made prescription only in 1941. That restriction had been widely flouted during the war years, but the nominal framework remained. After 1945, as West Germany began its long process of reconstruction under Allied occupation and the stabilizing influence of the Marshall Plan, Pervitin did not disappear from German medicine. It remained available by prescription. Doctors continued to prescribe it for depression, for fatigue, for the particular psychological weight of a population that had survived one of the most catastrophic events in human history, and was now required to function normally in its aftermath. And our students used it. Academics used it. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of West Germany, the man who would guide the country through its post-war reconstruction and its re-entry into the Western Alliance, took it regularly through the 1960s, prescribed by his physicians as a routine part of his demanding schedule. Nobody in those years was particularly alarmed by this. The mechanisms of addiction were not yet fully understood. The concept of neurotoxicity, of a substance that does not merely affect the brain while you take it but permanently alters its architecture, was still being assembled from scattered clinical observations and animal studies that had not yet reached sufficient weight to change the consensus. And the consensus in the medical world of the late 1940s and early 1950s was that amphetamine class stimulants were broadly useful, moderately risky in the way that all powerful medications carried some risk, and not the kind of problem that required anything more urgent than the ordinary caution applied to any controlled substance. Pervitin would remain on prescription in West Germany until 1972, and in East Germany until 1988. 43 years after the end of the war, German pharmacies were still dispensing a variant of the drug that had fueled the Blitzkrieg to patients who needed help with their energy levels. The molecule was patient. It understood that it did not need to rush. Across the Atlantic, the American pharmaceutical industry was conducting a quieter version of the same process and reaching conclusions that would set the stage for what many historians of medicine now consider one of the most consequential failures of medical ethics in the 20th century. The relationship between American medicine and amphetamine-class stimulants predated the war. Smith, Klein, and French had been selling Benzedrine, the American amphetamine, somewhat less potent than methamphetamine, but belonging to the same chemical family, since 1932, initially as an inhaler for nasal congestion. The inhaler had almost immediately acquired a secondary reputation among the people using it, because Benzedrine did not merely clear the sinuses. It also produced a marked elevation in mood, energy, and mental alertness that its users found considerably more interesting than the relief of nasal congestion. By the late 1930s, Benzedrine was being marketed in tablet form for narcolepsy, depression, and obesity. The American military had issued it to soldiers and pilots during the war. The Allies had their own pharmacological program, somewhat less systematic than Germany's, but no less real. By 1945, the American medical establishment had a decade of clinical experience with amphetamine-class drugs, a substantial body of enthusiastic published literature attesting to their usefulness, and a patient population that had, in many cases, been introduced to the drugs during their military service and had not forgotten the experience. What the American pharmaceutical industry had, additionally, was a problem of market positioning. The war was over. The soldier market was gone. The government contracts for military-issue stimulants had ended. And the companies that had built production capacity, distribution networks, and promotional relationships with the medical profession around these substances were now looking for the next application, the next patient population, the next reason for the family doctor to reach for the prescription pad. They found one, or rather, they found several. But the most commercially significant, the one that would define the 1950s chapter of this story, was a demographic that had been quietly accumulating need for years, largely invisible to the medical establishment, because the kind of need they carried was not the kind that appeared in textbooks. American housewives. Consider what that phrase contained in 1950. The enormous invisible labor of managing a household without the machinery that would eventually lighten it. Cooking from scratch for families of 4, 5, 6 children. Cleaning without dishwashers or laundry machines of any reliability. Managing the social expectations of suburban life. The spotless home, the perfect dinner, the composed and cheerful presentation of self to a husband returning from work who had not witnessed the 10 hours of sustained physical and organizational labor that made the scene before him possible. Add to this the social and psychological pressures of post-war domesticity, the expectation that women who had, during the war years, worked in factories and offices and proved themselves capable of an enormous range of professional tasks, would now return smoothly and contentedly to the domestic sphere. The gap between expectation and reality, between what these women knew they were capable of and what the culture now required them to perform, produced a kind of chronic low-grade exhaustion and dissatisfaction that medicine did not yet have an adequate name for. Betty Friedan would eventually call it the problem that has no name, in a book published in 1963 that would become one of the foundational texts of second-wave feminism. But in 1950, the medical establishment's response to this unnamed problem was not sociological analysis. It was pharmacological. Smith, Klein, and French understood what they were looking at. So did Abbott Laboratories, with their methamphetamine product, Desoxin, marketed for depression and obesity. So did the smaller pharmaceutical companies circling the same opportunity with their own amphetamine and methamphetamine formulations, their own advertising budgets, and their own medical representatives calling on family doctors across the country with samples and literature and the smooth, confident language of corporate medicine. The advertising that began to appear in medical journals in the early 1950s is, from this distance, extraordinary to read. It depicted women, tired women, overweight women, sad women, and offered the physician a solution that was framed in the language of modern medicine's best traditions: scientific, compassionate, evidence-based. The drugs were described as safe, effective, and appropriate for long-term use. One set of advertisements, directed at general practitioners, showed a patient, a woman, always a woman, in a state of visible suffering, and offered the physician the opportunity to relieve that suffering with a prescription. The subtext was clear. To not prescribe was to fail your patient. To prescribe was to help. Doctors prescribed. They did so in good faith, for the most part. The men, and they were almost entirely men, who ran family practices in American towns and suburbs in the 1950s, were not cynics or criminals. They were physicians trained in a tradition that trusted pharmaceutical company literature, that respected the endorsement of the American Medical Association, that believed in the progress of modern medicine as a straightforwardly beneficial force. When a pharmaceutical representative told them that a drug was safe and that their patients would benefit from it, they had as yet insufficient reason to disbelieve him, and the patients did benefit initially, in precisely the way the woman in the hook benefits, and in those first 30 minutes after swallowing the white tablet. The fatigue lifted, the mood improved, the sense of capability returned. The women who received these prescriptions reported, in many cases, genuine relief. They felt better. They functioned better. Their doctors saw the improvement and felt confirmed in their judgment. What nobody was measuring, what nobody had the instruments to measure yet, or the willingness to look for, was what was happening beneath the relief, in the cellular architecture of the brain's reward system, in the dopamine terminals and the transporter proteins and the synaptic vesicles that were, week by week and month by month, being altered in ways that no amount of rest would ever fully reverse. But that part of the story had not been written yet. In 1950, in 1951, in 1952, the only story being told was the one the pharmaceutical companies had composed. A suffering patient, a compassionate physician, and a small white pill that made things better. The script was already written. All that remained was to sell it. And sell it they did. In 1952, the Food and Drug Administration estimated American production of amphetamine and methamphetamine salts at nearly 4 times the figure from just 3 years earlier. The machinery of pharmaceutical capitalism, advertising, medical education, insurance coverage, the professional relationships between pharmaceutical representatives and the physicians who trusted them, was accelerating a market that had, in the space of a few post-war years, grown from a marginal specialty into something approaching a mass phenomenon, and the specific product that would define the decade's most audacious chapter in this story had not yet arrived. That would come in 1960 with a name that sounds almost innocuously technical: Obertrol. But before Obertrol, before the full flowering of what historians would later call America's first amphetamine epidemic, there was a quieter moment. A moment in which a doctor, somewhere in the American Midwest, or the American South, or the American Northeast, sat across a desk from a woman who was tired and sad and overwhelmed, and reached for his prescription pad, and wrote down a drug that had spent its first decades in a Japanese chemistry journal, its middle years in the Blitzkrieg, and was now, in the autumn of a century that had survived more than it should have had to, about to enter its most insidious phase, the phase in which it called itself medicine, the phase in which it was handed to people who trusted the system that was handing it to them, the phase in which the damage would be measured not in battlefield casualties or post-war addiction statistics, but in the quiet, interior devastation of ordinary women living ordinary lives in ordinary houses, who had no idea that what they were swallowing each morning with their glass of water was the same compound that had kept kamikaze pilots focused on their final approaches. The phase, in other words, that the hook of this story is about. We are almost there. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Margaret. She is 34 years old. She lives in a white clapboard house in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, and on a street where the lawns are kept to a uniform length and the hedges are trimmed on the same schedule, and the driveways hold the same model, years of the same American automobiles. She has 3 children. Her husband works in insurance. She has not worked outside the home since their first child was born in 1948, a decision that was made in the way that most decisions are made in that era. Not through deliberate choice, so much as through the accumulated weight of what was expected, what was assumed, what the culture had decided was the natural and proper arrangement of things. She is, by the measures her world applies to such assessments, doing fine. She is also exhausted in a way she cannot adequately explain to anyone, including herself. It is not the exhaustion of a single hard day or a sleepless night. It is deeper and stranger than that. A persistent grey weight that has settled somewhere behind her sternum and does not lift regardless of how much sleep she gets, regardless of how many tasks she completes, regardless of how many evenings she sits across the dinner table from her husband and her children and performs the contentment that she genuinely wishes she felt. She is 20 pounds heavier than she was when she married. She has mentioned this to her husband once, carefully, and regretted doing so. She has not mentioned the other thing. The grey weight, the sense of moving through her days at a slight remove from herself. Because she does not have language for it that sounds like a medical complaint rather than ingratitude. In the spring of 1957, she goes to see her family doctor. His name is Dr. Harmon. He is 52 years old, well respected in the community, a man who keeps a clean office and a warm manner, and a genuine concern for the welfare of his patients that is not performative. He has been practicing for 22 years. He reads the major medical journals. He attends the conferences. He trusts the literature. He listens to Margaret describe her symptoms, the fatigue, the weight, the flatness of affect that she struggles to put into words. And he nods with the measured compassion of a man who has heard variations of this before. Many variations. In the past several years, a significant proportion of his female patients have presented with something that resembles what Margaret is describing, and he has come to think of it as the particular burden of modern domesticity. Real, consequential, and fortunately, increasingly treatable. He reaches for his prescription pad. He writes down a drug. He explains that it will help with the weight and with the energy. He says it is perfectly safe. He has prescribed it many times. His patients do well on it. Margaret takes the prescription to the pharmacy on her way home. The pharmacist fills it without comment. She takes the first tablet the following morning with a glass of water, standing at the kitchen sink. What happens next, she will describe for the rest of her life as the day she first felt like herself again. The drug Dr. Harmon prescribed had several possible names in 1957, depending on which pharmaceutical company's representative had most recently visited his office. It might have been Disoxin, manufactured by Abbott Laboratories, approved by the FDA for obesity and depression, available in tablets of 5 milligrams. It might have been Methadone, the Welcome brand, marketed with particular enthusiasm for weight management in women. It might have been Dexamel, the combination product from Smith, Klein, and French that blended dextroamphetamine with a barbiturate sedative, the sedative designed to smooth away the jitteriness that some patients experienced from the stimulant component alone. Take something to go up, take something to come down, sell both. By 1960, a new entry would join this catalog, Betrayal. The name sounds almost benign, a slight, technical-sounding word with the suffix that American pharmaceutical marketing had learned to attach to products seeking an air of clinical legitimacy. Betrayal was manufactured by a company called Betrayal Pharmaceuticals, and it contained, in its original FDA-approved formulation, a mixture of 4 different amphetamine salts. 2 of them were forms of methamphetamine, methamphetamine saccharate, methamphetamine hydrochloride. The FDA approved it in 1960 for the treatment of exogenous obesity. Exogenous obesity, the clinical language for being heavier than the prevailing standard of beauty required you to be, in an era that had decided, with the particular cruelty of commercial culture, that thinness was both a virtue and a responsibility. Betrayal was available in 10 milligram and 20 milligram tablets. It was prescribed alongside diet programs. It was marketed to physicians as a tool for patient compliance, because the drug that suppressed appetite and elevated mood made patients feel that they were succeeding, which made them more likely to continue the regimen, which made the physician's intervention look effective. The circular logic of this: we give you a drug that makes you feel capable of change, call the feeling change, and measure our success by whether you continue to want the drug, was not, in 1960, being examined with any particular rigor. The profits were extraordinary. One physician operating what was colloquially known as a diet clinic, a practice built almost entirely around the prescription of amphetamine-class drugs for weight loss, was found, when investigators eventually examined his records, to have purchased 100,000 amphetamine tablets for $71 and sold them to patients for $12,000. The mathematics of this transaction require no commentary. They speak entirely for themselves. The advertising that sustained this market is worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something important about how a society can be systematically misled by institutions it trusts. The pharmaceutical companies of the 1950s and early 1960s were not, for the most part, advertising their products directly to patients. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising was not yet the norm. Instead, they advertised in medical journals, the publications that physicians read, that shaped clinical thinking, and that conveyed the consensus of professional medicine on the questions that mattered most to the practitioners who subscribed. The advertisements that appeared in those pages were masterpieces of a particular kind of persuasion. They showed patients in distress, almost always women, almost always depicted in the language of domestic overwhelm, and positioned the physician as the agent of relief. One recurring visual vocabulary showed a woman sitting at a kitchen table, her head in her hands, surrounded by the evidence of household demands she could not meet. Another showed a woman staring blankly from a window with an expression of flattened affect that the caption described as depression. The solution in each case was a prescription, and the prescription, more often than not, was an amphetamine or methamphetamine product, are framed in the clinical language of evidence-based medicine, endorsed by the professional associations that physicians trusted, distributed by representatives who had built genuine relationships with the doctors they visited and who believed, in many cases, what they were saying. Some of the advertisements included phrases that, read now, require a moment of stillness to process. One promoted a methamphetamine-containing product for the housewife who needs to be on her toes all day. Another described the target patient as the woman who finds herself unable to manage the demands of her daily role. The language was compassionate in tone and devastating in implication. It accepted, without question, that the role being demanded of these women was reasonable, and that the failure to meet it without pharmacological assistance was a medical problem located in the woman herself, rather than a structural problem located in the expectations being imposed upon her. Nobody in those advertisements suggested that the woman at the kitchen table with her head in her hands might simply be doing too much. Nobody suggested that the solution might not come in a tablet. By the early 1960s, the scale of what was happening had become almost incomprehensible in retrospect, though at the time it was spreading gradually enough that the overall picture was difficult to assemble from any single vantage point. In 1962, the Food and Drug Administration conducted a survey of American amphetamine and methamphetamine production. The figure they arrived at was 80,000 kilograms of amphetamine salts produced in a single year. 80,000 kilograms. Researchers who later analyzed this number calculated that it represented sufficient medication for approximately 43 standard 10 milligram doses for every man, woman, and child in the United States. 43 doses for every American in a single year. The overwhelming majority of these doses were going to adults on prescription through the ordinary channels of American medicine: the family doctor, the diet clinic, the psychiatrist who had learned, as his colleagues had, that the drugs worked in the short term and that his patients appreciated them. By 1970, according to public health estimates, 5% of the American population, approximately 9.7 million people, were using some form of prescription amphetamine. Not illicitly, not in back alleys or at underground parties. In their homes, in their kitchens, in their cars on the school run, with full medical sanction and a pharmacy receipt. Margaret was among them. She had been taking her prescription for 3 years by 1960. The initial relief, that first morning at the sink, the crystalline focus, the return of herself, had been real. She does not doubt it, even now. But somewhere in the second year, something had shifted in a way she found difficult to articulate. She needed the pill to feel normal now, whereas before she had needed it to feel better than normal. Without it, the grey weight returned with a heaviness that seemed, somehow, deeper than before, as though the floor had been lowered during her absence. She mentioned this to Dr. Harmon. He told her the medication was working. He renewed the prescription. She did not ask further questions, because she did not yet have the framework within which the right questions could be formed. The concept that the drug might be creating the very deficiency it was appearing to remedy, that the grey weight of the years without medication was not her original condition, but a condition the medication had produced, was not a concept that the medical literature available to Dr. Harmon had equipped him to recognize, let alone explain to his patient. He was not a bad doctor. He was a good doctor practicing in a system that had been supplied with bad information and had not yet been given better. Not everyone was incurious. In 1962, at the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act were passed in the wake of the thalidomide disaster, a catastrophe in which a drug prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness had caused severe birth defects in thousands of children across Europe. The amendments required, for the first time, that pharmaceutical companies demonstrate both the safety and the efficacy of their products before receiving FDA approval. The era of the confident, largely unverified medical claim was, at least in principle, ending. The new standards began slowly to expose the thinness of the evidence base that had supported a decade of enthusiastic amphetamine prescribing. Studies that examined long-term outcomes rather than short-term symptom relief told a different and more troubling story. And the weight loss attributed to amphetamine prescriptions was, in most cases, modest and temporary. Within months of beginning a course of treatment, patients frequently required higher doses to achieve the same effect. Cessation of the drug was associated with profound rebound depression, fatigue, and weight gain, effects that were, in many cases, worse than the original condition the drug had been prescribed to treat. Some physicians began to see a pattern they could not ignore. Patients who had been on amphetamine prescriptions for several years presented differently from patients just beginning treatment. The initial brightness, the energy, the mood elevation, the motivated productivity had flattened into something more mechanical. They needed the drug to function. Without it, they could not get out of bed. With it, and they felt not euphoric, but merely functional. The distance between those two states, between what the drug had first promised and what it was now delivering, was the unmapped territory of amphetamine dependence, and medicine was only beginning to acknowledge it existed. By the mid-1960s, reports of amphetamine-related psychiatric emergencies were accumulating in hospital records. Psychosis, paranoia, hallucinations, cardiac events. A product marketed for its ability to make women feel capable of managing their days was landing some of those women in emergency rooms with symptoms that physicians were, for the first time, connecting directly to the pills in their medicine cabinets. The FDA began to pay closer attention. So did the press. Stories appeared, cautiously at first, and then with gathering momentum, questioning the safety of the prescription amphetamine market. The phrase rainbow pills entered the cultural vocabulary, a reference to the color-coded amphetamine and methamphetamine tablets being dispensed by diet clinics with a casualness that, viewed from a slight distance, began to look less like medicine and more like a commercial enterprise built on chemical dependency. Some of these diet clinics were investigated. What investigators found was not reassuring. Patients were receiving prescriptions at the rate of multiple refills per month. Dosages had escalated well beyond what the original clinical literature had described as therapeutic. Side effects that should have prompted reconsideration were being managed not by reducing the amphetamine dose, but by adding new prescriptions, barbiturates for the jitteriness, sleeping pills for the insomnia, mood stabilizers for the emotional volatility, until some patients were carrying 3 or 4 interdependent prescriptions, each managing the side effects of another, the whole system resting on the foundation of a drug that had been engineered to push soldiers past the boundaries of human endurance. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. It was a sweeping piece of legislation that reorganized American drug policy around a scheduling system designed to reflect abuse potential, medical utility, and safety profile. Methamphetamine was placed in Schedule II, a classification that acknowledged its limited medical utility while imposing strict controls on its manufacture and prescription. The era of the freely prescribed methamphetamine tablet, the open-shelf diet clinic, or the Obertrol prescription written with a reassuring smile, was over. Or rather, it was over for the people who could afford to replace it with something else. The FDA withdrew approval for Betrayal in 1973, citing insufficient evidence of efficacy and serious concerns about abuse potential. The company would eventually reformulate, removing the methamphetamine components, replacing them with different amphetamine salts, changing the name. The product that emerged from this reformulation would, in the following decades, be prescribed to millions of American children and adults for a condition called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It would be called Adderall. But that is a different story, for a different evening. Margaret stopped taking her medication in 1971, not because of the Controlled Substances Act, though the new restrictions made renewal more complicated. She stopped because her youngest child, then 16, found the bottle in the bathroom cabinet and asked her what it was. She told him it was for energy. He looked at her with the particular directness that teenagers sometimes achieve and asked why she needed a pill to have energy. She did not have an answer that satisfied either of them. The withdrawal took 8 months before she felt, in any consistent way, like a person who was functioning without assistance. The grey weight returned in the first weeks with an intensity that frightened her. She slept 14 hours a day for a period she would later be unable to accurately recall. Food tasted like nothing, the morning light that had once felt on the medication, like an invitation felt without it, like an accusation. She recovered, slowly, incompletely, in the way that recovery from something like this proceeds, not as a return to a prior state, but as the gradual construction of a new one. She was 48 years old by the time she felt that the new state was stable. She had been taking methamphetamine under a physician's supervision with a pharmacy receipt, believing it to be medicine, for 14 years. She was not unusual. She was, in fact, typical. And what the drug had been doing to the architecture of her brain during those 14 years, the specific, measurable, physiological damage that no amount of recovery would entirely reverse, is something that the science of her era didn't yet have the instruments to see. We do now, and that is where we are going next. Before we descend into the biology, we need to understand something about the brain that most people spend their entire lives not knowing. The brain does not experience reality directly. It experiences a chemical representation of reality. Every sensation, every emotion, every moment of pleasure or pain or meaning or meaninglessness that you have ever had, every conversation that moved you, every piece of music that stopped you in your tracks, every meal that tasted like something worth being alive for. None of these things entered your consciousness as raw experience. They entered as electrical signals that were translated at the synaptic junctions between neurons by a precise and ancient chemistry. And at the center of that chemistry, governing the experience of reward and motivation and the fundamental question of whether anything is worth doing at all, sits a single molecule: dopamine. It is worth taking a moment to understand what dopamine actually is, because it is so frequently mischaracterized, reduced to the brain's pleasure chemical, as though its function were simply to make things feel good. That is not quite right, and the imprecision matters. Dopamine is not primarily the chemical of pleasure. It is the chemical of meaning, of motivation, of the calculation your brain performs thousands of times per day that determines whether a thing is worth pursuing. When you are hungry and you smell food cooking, the dopamine response is not the pleasure of eating. It is the anticipation, the urgent sense of forward momentum towards something that your brain has identified as valuable. When you sit down to work on something difficult and feel, suddenly, the pull of concentration, that is dopamine. When you hear the first notes of a piece of music you love and feel something shift in your chest, that is dopamine signaling that this matters, that this is worth your attention, that this is the kind of thing that makes being alive feel like something other than an administrative burden. In a healthy brain, dopamine is released in precise, purposeful amounts. A meal, depending on how hungry you are and how much you enjoy it, might produce a dopamine response of perhaps 100 to 200 units. Not a scientific measurement in the conventional sense, but a useful way of imagining the scale. The experience of falling in love produces a more sustained response, spread across time, building slowly. Physical exercise produces a modest but reliable release. A creative achievement, finishing something you have worked on for months and solving a problem that has resisted you, produces a response calibrated to the difficulty and the meaning of the achievement. The system is self-regulating. The brain does not want to be overwhelmed by dopamine any more than a river wants to be overwhelmed by a flood. When dopamine levels rise, the brain downregulates. It reduces the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. It produces less of it for a time. It maintains a kind of homeostasis that keeps the signal meaningful. If everything produced the same overwhelming response, nothing would be prioritized. The system would lose its navigational function. This regulation is the key to everything that follows. Methamphetamine enters the brain within seconds of being administered. It crosses the blood-brain barrier with an efficiency that most substances cannot match, because its molecular structure allows it to slip through the cellular membrane that protects the brain from many of the chemicals circulating in the bloodstream. Once inside, it does something that no natural stimulus can do, and nothing in the brain's evolutionary history has prepared it to handle. It does not merely trigger dopamine release, it commandeers the entire release mechanism and forces it to operate at a magnitude that has no natural equivalent. Here is what happens in the sequence that the neuroscience has painstakingly assembled over the past 4 decades. In a normal dopamine neuron, dopamine is manufactured inside the cell and stored in tiny membrane-bound packages called vesicles. Essentially, small sealed containers that hold the dopamine ready for release when the appropriate signal arrives. When a neuron fires, these vesicles move to the edge of the cell and release their contents into the synapse, the gap between neurons, where the dopamine binds to receptors on the receiving neuron, delivers its signal, and is then collected back into the original cell by transporter proteins to be recycled and used again. This is an elegant closed system, precise, economical, designed for longevity. Methamphetamine dismantles it. The molecule enters the dopamine neuron and attacks simultaneously on multiple fronts. It penetrates the vesicles themselves, the sealed storage containers, and causes them to rupture their contents into the cell's cytoplasm, flooding the interior of the neuron with dopamine that was never meant to be there. Simultaneously, it reverses the function of the transporter proteins on the cell surface. The proteins that are supposed to collect dopamine back from the synapse are forced to run in the opposite direction, actively pumping dopamine out into the synapse instead of drawing it in. And it blocks the normal reuptake process entirely, so that the dopamine flooding out of the neuron cannot be retrieved. The result is a dopamine release that is not a signal. It is an explosion. Studies measuring the dopamine response to methamphetamine in the brain's reward center have found responses ranging from 500 to over 1,000 times the baseline level. Not twice the baseline, not 10 times the baseline, 1,000 times. The synapse is not receiving a message. It is receiving a detonation. And the receptors designed to detect and respond to dopamine are saturated to a degree that has no parallel in ordinary experience, overwhelmed by a chemical signal so far outside their designed operating range that the closest analogy is not pleasure but obliteration. This is the high. This is what Margaret felt that first morning at the kitchen sink when the pill dissolved and the chemistry arrived. Not joy exactly, though it presents itself as joy. Not confidence, though it presents itself as confidence. It is the experience of a brain that has just had its dopamine system forced to maximum output simultaneously across its entire reward architecture. The nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, the circuits that govern motivation and pleasure, and the sense that the world is a place worth engaging with. For 30 minutes or an hour, or several hours depending on the dose and the route of administration, the brain operates at a level of chemical intensity that it was never designed to sustain. And then it stops. The crash is not simply the absence of the high. That framing, while common, misses what is actually happening. When the methamphetamine clears and the forced dopamine release ends, the brain is not returning to baseline. It cannot return to baseline because baseline no longer exists in the form it held before. The vesicles that stored dopamine have been emptied and in some cases physically damaged. The transporter proteins that collected and recycled dopamine have been run in reverse so aggressively that they require time to recover their normal function. And the receptors that received the dopamine flood have done what the brain does when it is overwhelmed. They have downregulated, reducing their own sensitivity to protect themselves from the excess. What this means in the hours and days following methamphetamine use is that the brain's dopamine system is operating at a level significantly below its original capacity. The stockrooms have been emptied. The recycling mechanism is impaired. The receivers have gone quiet. And in this depleted state, the world does not merely fail to produce pleasure. It fails to produce meaning. Food tastes like nothing. Conversation feels like effort without reward. The sunlight coming through the window that should, by any rational measure, feel like something. Warmth, beauty, the simple fact of being alive on a morning, produces no response. And the brain that has been blasted with a dopamine signal 1,000 times above baseline is now functioning at a fraction of its ordinary capacity and the ordinary stimuli of ordinary life. The stimuli that, in a healthy brain, produce those small, precise, purposeful dopamine signals that make getting through a day feel worthwhile, register as nothing. This is the crash. Not sadness exactly, though it produces an experience that is functionally indistinguishable from profound depression. It is the experience of a reward system that has been temporarily stripped of its operating capacity. The grey weight that Margaret had described before she ever took the drug. That persistent flatness, that sense of moving through her days at a remove, was, in retrospect, mild and manageable compared to what waited for her on the other side of methadone. But here is the cruelest mechanism in the entire story. The only thing that reliably relieves the crash is another dose. Not because the person is weak, not because of a failure of character or willpower or moral seriousness, but because the brain, which has had its dopamine system comprehensively depleted, knows exactly where the dopamine is. It remembers, with the particular vividness that the dopamine system uses to tag experiences as worth repeating, precisely what resolved this state before. The craving is not a desire in the ordinary sense. It is a navigational signal from a damaged system pointing toward the only restoration it can identify. This is the mechanism of addiction, not corruption, not weakness. Neurology can now extend this process across months, across years. This is where the science moves from the temporary into the territory of the permanent. Margaret took her prescription for 14 years in the brains of people who use methamphetamine chronically over periods of months and years. Researchers have documented damage that goes far beyond temporary depletion. Using positron emission tomography, PET scanning, and magnetic resonance imaging, neuroscientists have been able to look inside the brains of long-term methamphetamine users and see, with a specificity that removes all ambiguity, what the drug has done to the physical structure of the brain. The dopamine terminals, the axon endings that release dopamine into the synapse, degenerate. Not in every case and not uniformly, but the pattern is consistent enough that it appears in study after study across different research groups and different populations. The cells themselves begin to die. The loss of dopamine-producing neurons in the striatum, the brain region most centrally involved in reward, motivation, and the experience of pleasure, mirrors, in its pattern and its progression, the early stages of Parkinson's disease. This is not a metaphor. The comparison between methamphetamine-related brain damage and the neurodegeneration of Parkinson's is drawn directly from the neuroimaging and pathology data. Multiple studies have found that long-term methamphetamine users show loss of dopamine transporters in the striatum comparable to patients in the early stages of Parkinson's, and the risk of developing Parkinson's disease is measurably elevated in people with a history of methamphetamine use, at a level that cannot be explained by factors other than the drug itself. In the hippocampus, the region most critically involved in the formation and retrieval of memories, methamphetamine causes measurable shrinkage. The hippocampi of long-term users are physically smaller than those of non-users, matched for age and other variables. The reduction in volume corresponds to measurable impairments in memory function, not the ordinary forgetting of normal aging, but specific deficits in the ability to form new memories and retrieve established ones. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, for the capacity to plan ahead, to evaluate consequences, and to regulate impulse, shows reduced gray matter density. The limbic cortex, the paralimbic cortex, regions governing emotional regulation, the ability to modulate one's own affective states, the capacity to experience and process emotions without being overwhelmed by them, all show measurable deterioration. These are not soft findings from small studies. They have been replicated across multiple research groups, using multiple imaging modalities in multiple countries over several decades of accumulating evidence. The picture they paint is consistent and is now considered settled science within the relevant research communities. Methamphetamine, taken regularly over time, physically dismantles the brain's reward architecture. And the recovery? It exists. It is real, but it is partial, and it is slow, and it is not guaranteed. Studies examining dopamine transporter levels in methamphetamine users who have achieved abstinence show a gradual recovery over time. After 12 to 17 months of sustained abstinence, transporter levels show meaningful improvement, increases of 15 to 20% above the levels measured during active use or shortly after stopping, 15 to 20% after more than a year of complete abstinence, in brains that were operating during active use at transporter levels that some researchers compared to the dopamine system of a person decades older than the user's chronological age. The recovery is real. The people who achieve it describe it in terms that suggest genuine restoration, the return of pleasure in ordinary things, the recovery of emotional range, or the gradual re-emergence of a self that can engage with the world without chemical assistance. But they also describe something else. A before and an after that are different in quality from the normal experience of aging or recovery from illness. A sense that the instrument through which they experience pleasure and motivation and meaning has been recalibrated at a lower sensitivity than the one they started with, and that the recalibration, while livable, is permanent. Some things do not come back. Let us return now to Margaret, standing at her kitchen sink in the autumn of 1955, bone-tired, reaching for the amber bottle, swallowing the white tablet, feeling 30 minutes later the wave of crystalline clarity that will become the signature experience of the next 14 years of her life. What was happening in that moment was this: methamphetamine was crossing her blood-brain barrier and forcing her dopamine system to release at a magnitude 1,000 times beyond what any natural stimulus in her life could produce. The clarity she felt was real. It was the experience of a brain flooded with the chemical of meaning and motivation, operating at an intensity it had never previously achieved. The capability she felt was real. The tasks that had seemed impossible now registered as straightforward, because her brain was signaling their completion with a dopamine response far beyond what ordinary achievement would generate. And with every dose, over the weeks and months and years that followed, the system was being quietly eroded. The vesicles were rupturing. The transporter proteins were being run backwards. The dopamine terminals were degenerating in those precise regions of the limbic system and striatum that governed her capacity to feel that her life was worth living. The grey weight she had taken the drug to escape was not her original state. It was the advancing consequence of the drug itself, requiring an ever-increasing dose to manage a deficiency the drug had created. Her doctor did not know this. The pharmaceutical company that made the drug suspected some of it and chose not to investigate further. The FDA did not have the imaging technology to see it, and lacked the regulatory framework that would have compelled them to look. And Margaret did not know any of it. She knew only that the pill worked, and then that the pill was necessary, and then that without the pill, she was someone she did not recognize. And then, 8 months after she stopped, in the slow and effortful reconstruction of a neurological system that would never fully return to what it had been, that she had been lied to, though not by any single person who had intended her harm. She had been lied to by a system, by the accumulated indifference of profit and institutional inertia, and the fundamental human tendency to believe that what makes us feel better in the short term is doing us good. The molecule had not changed. It was the same molecule Nagai had synthesized in his Tokyo laboratory 62 years before. The same molecule Ogata had crystallized, the same molecule pressed into Pervitin tablets and distributed to soldiers who marched for 10 days without sleeping. the same molecule administered to young men in cockpits on the morning of their final flights. Only the bottle had changed. Only the name. The Controlled Substances Act was signed into law on October 27, 1970. It was, in its architecture, a serious piece of legislation, a genuine attempt to impose order on a pharmaceutical landscape that had spent the better part of 3 decades operating on optimism and profit margin rather than evidence and restraint. The scheduling system it created, 5 tiers, ranked by abuse potential and medical utility, was designed to ensure that the most dangerous substances received the most rigorous oversight. Methamphetamine was placed in Schedule 2, not banned outright because its limited medical applications were real, but controlled, regulated. No longer something a diet doctor could press into the hands of a patient for $71 per 100,000 tablets. The prescription pads went still. The pharmaceutical production lines slowed, then reconfigured for the narrow medical use the new law permitted. And a vacuum opened. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does a market. The people who understood this most immediately and moved to fill it most efficiently were not chemists or pharmaceutical executives. They were men who wore leather and rode Harley-Davidsons and had been living, for the better part of a decade, at the precise intersection of the drug economy and the criminal infrastructure capable of sustaining it. The outlaw motorcycle gangs of the American West, the Hells Angels most prominently, but also the bandidos, the pagans, the outlaws, the sons of silence, had been circling the methamphetamine market since the early 1960s, when the drug first began leaking from pharmaceutical channels into recreational use among the speed freak subculture of California's urban margins. They had watched the market develop. They had built relationships with the chemists who understood how to make the drug outside of industrial pharmaceutical conditions. They had, in some cases, been using the drug themselves. For the same reasons soldiers had used it. For the same reasons housewives had used it. Because it worked, and in the short term. And the short term was the only term that the culture of outlaw biking tended to prioritize. When the Controlled Substances Act closed the pharmaceutical door, they walked through the one that opened. The drug they produced was made by a method called the P2P route, named for phenyl-2-propanone, an industrial chemical used in perfumes, fumigation, and a range of manufacturing processes that had until this moment attracted no particular regulatory attention. P2P was uncontrolled. It was obtainable. And a chemist who knew what to do with it could produce methamphetamine in conditions far removed from a pharmaceutical factory, in a garage, in a rural barn, in the back room of a property chosen specifically for its distance from neighbors who might notice the smell. The smell, it should be noted, is significant, and the chemical process of methamphetamine production generates fumes that are toxic, flammable, and distinctive in a way that makes concealment in populated areas complicated. This is why the biker-era meth labs clustered in the rural West, in the desert communities of California and Arizona and Nevada, in the sparse agricultural landscapes of the inland valleys, in places where the nearest neighbor was far enough away that the chemical signature of the cooking process dissipated before it reached anyone who might care. The drug moved through distribution networks that the gangs had built for other commodities and now repurposed for this one. And somewhere in the process of moving it, of transporting the finished product from the rural labs where it was cooked to the urban and suburban markets where it was consumed, someone made a practical decision about concealment that would inadvertently give the drug one of the names it carries to this day. They hid it in the crankcase of motorcycles. Crank. The word passed from the biker world into the broader street vocabulary and stuck there, accumulating the specific associations of a drug culture that was very different from the suburban prescription culture it had replaced. Crank was not something your doctor gave you. Crank was something you bought from a man who kept it in his engine. The distance between the amber bottle in Margaret's medicine cabinet and the crankcase of a Hells Angels Harley-Davidson is, in molecular terms, essentially zero. In cultural terms, it is the distance between the world the pharmaceutical industry had constructed and the world that pharmaceutical industry's failure had produced. By the mid-1970s, the scale of the underground market was becoming visible in the data that law enforcement was beginning to collect. In the second half of that decade, seizures of methamphetamine laboratories in the western United States increased by 1,200%. Not 12%, 1,200. The vacuum that the Controlled Substances Act had created was being filled with a speed and completeness that the architects of the legislation had not anticipated, because they had understood the problem as one of supply without sufficiently accounting for the persistence of demand. In 1980, the DEA responded by scheduling P2P as a controlled substance. The precursor chemical that the biker labs depended on was now regulated. Production became more difficult. The Hells Angels, who had built their methamphetamine operation around the P2P method, found themselves unable to maintain the supply chain that their market required. The equilibrium broke, and into the space it left came something larger, more efficient, and very much harder to stop. Beginning in the late 1980s, traffickers from the Mexican state of Michoacan, men embedded in the organizational structures that would eventually become the cartels the world now knows by name, discovered that methamphetamine could be produced using ephedrine rather than P2P, ephedrine, the same molecule that Nagai Nagayoshi had isolated from Ma Huang in his Tokyo laboratory in 1885. A century after that isolation, it was still the key, still the precursor, still the chemical door through which the molecule passed into existence. The ephedrine method produced a product that was, in important respects, superior to what the biker labs had been making, purer, more potent, more consistent in its effects. And the cartels that adopted and industrialized this method did not produce it in garages or rural barns. They built facilities, clandestine, yes, but operating at scales that belonged to industrial chemistry, rather than backroom improvisation. Superlabs, law enforcement would come to call them, capable of producing not grams, but pounds, not pounds, but hundreds of pounds, of methamphetamine in a single production cycle. The price collapsed. The purity rose. The product flooded across the border into the United States with an efficiency that overwhelmed the interdiction efforts assembled against it, because the cartels had resources and organizational capacity and the particular adaptability of enterprises that have survived by learning to route around obstacles. Methamphetamine, which had spent the 1970s as a regional problem centered in the rural West, spread through the 1990s into the Midwest, the South, the rural communities of the American interior that had no particular history with the drug, but possessed all of the social and economic conditions that make a cheap, powerful stimulant an attractive proposition unemployment, isolation, the specific despair of communities that had watched their economic foundations erode without replacement. Thus, the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 restricted the sale of pseudoephedrine, the cold medicine ingredient that had become the primary precursor for domestic small-scale production. It worked briefly. Lab seizures declined. Domestic production fell. The cartels adapted. They returned to the P2P method, the same industrial route that the biker chemists of the 1970s had pioneered, and they applied to it the same industrial scale they had brought to ephedrine production. The P2P methamphetamine that now dominates the American market is, by some accounts, different in its neurological profile from the ephedrine-based product it replaced. Some researchers have suggested it produces more severe and more persistent psychiatric effects, including psychosis and paranoid ideation that does not fully resolve with abstinence. The evidence is still being assembled, but the pattern is familiar. Every attempt to constrain the supply has produced an adaptation that ultimately delivers more product, more efficiently, to a market that has not meaningfully shrunk. Between 2011 and 2017, deaths linked to methamphetamine overdose in the United States quadrupled. As of the time this script was written, 6 cartels have been formally designated by the United States Department of State as the primary producers and distributors of methamphetamine consumed in America: the Sinaloa Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and 4 others whose names represent the industrialization of a molecule that began as a footnote in a Japanese chemistry journal in 1893. Somewhere in the highlands of Central Asia, on a windswept plateau where the winters are long and the soil is thin and the wind moves through the scrubby vegetation without interruption, the ephedra plant is growing. It looks the same as it has always looked: sparse, jointed, a dusty grey-green against the pale earth. The kind of plant a traveler would walk past without slowing. The kind of plant that has been growing in this precise form, in this precise place, for millions of years, long before the first healer brewed its stems into a bitter tea, long before Nagai Nagayoshi sat down in his Tokyo laboratory and decided to take it apart, long before any of the things that followed from that decision had any existence anywhere except in a future that no one could see. It does not know what has been done with what it contains. It grows. And the molecule that Nagai synthesized from that plant in 1893 has now passed through more than a century of human history, leaving behind it a trail that is not easy to look at directly for very long. Soldiers who fought for 10 days without sleeping and came home unable to feel anything without a pill. Women who were handed a chemical weapon with a reassuring smile and a prescription and told it was medicine. Communities dismantled by a substance that arrived cheap and pure and left behind psychiatric wreckage that generational recovery programs are still working to address. The betrayals embedded in this story are not all of the same kind. Some were institutional. The pharmaceutical companies that suppressed inconvenient data, the regulatory agencies that moved too slowly, and the medical journals that published enthusiasm rather than evidence. Some were structural. The social conditions that made exhausted women a market, that made unemployed men in rural communities a market, that created, in each era, a population primed to reach for something that promised relief from conditions that policy had failed to address. And some were simply human, The doctors who believed what they were told, the soldiers who took what they were given, the people who reached for something that felt like a solution and found, on the other side of it, a problem they had not been warned about. The molecule did not choose any of this. It is only a molecule, a small rearrangement of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, simpler in its structure than many of the compounds your own body produces every day. Its effects on the human brain are not malicious. They are simply what they are, operating according to the laws of chemistry, with perfect indifference to the lives they move through. The malice, to whatever extent that word applies, belongs to the choices made around the molecule, the decisions to deploy it, to prescribe it, to sell it, to protect the profits it generated, rather than the people it was consuming. Those decisions were made by human beings, in offices and laboratories and boardrooms and military command centers, across a century and across the breadth of the world. And the people who paid for those decisions were, for the most part, the people who had the least power to refuse. It is late now. Whatever time it is in your corner of the world, the night has deepened since we began, and the history we have traveled, from a quiet Japanese laboratory to the Blitzkrieg plains of France, to the suburban kitchens of post-war America, to the cartel super labs of Michoacan, is not a comfortable history. It does not resolve into anything clean. But it is important, not because the past can be changed. It cannot. But because the patterns it contains are not finished. The molecule is still here. The conditions that made it appealing in each era of its history, exhaustion, desperation, the search for capability in circumstances designed to produce incapacity, are still here. And the question of who we trust with the chemistry of the human brain and what we require of them in exchange for that trust is still unanswered. Rest now. The questions will keep until morning. They always do.